The video game industry owes a lot to Resident Evil. While it didn't invent the horror genre as we know it, it did redefine old traits common among already existing horror games and establish new ones. Horror games were changed forever after the original games released back in 1996, followed up by several sequels and re-releases. Resident Evil 2 was an excellent refinement of the first game's principles, while 3 took a different approach, being action-oriented, albeit with hit-and-miss results. After this period of constant success, however, the series went into a bit of an awkward period. The next main series entry, Code Veronica, was a respectable entry in its own right, but suffers from bloated level design and notably more opportunities to soft-lock yourself at certain points in the game, paired with some obnoxious enemy design, and it's no wonder why a lot of people aren't exactly keen on this title. In 2002, the original game got a remake, and that same year, Zero, a prequel, was released. But due to lacking sales, according to Capcom, I mean, from what I can find anyway, they both seem to have done fine, Capcom and series producer Shinji Mikami decided that this series cannot stay survival horror forever, and they decided to shift things into a new direction with the fourth entry. Resident Evil 4's development was a very troubled process of several scrapped ideas in an unfocused direction over the many years of its production. The team couldn't seem to decide if they wanted to implement more horror elements, or more action elements, or if they wanted to have paranormal stuff in there. I mean, that would just be stupid. Hallucinations and ghosts in my Resident Evil? Please. But eventually, the team finally decided to go all in on action-oriented gameplay. Now, after hearing all of that, imagine if this game was being made these days. It restarted development multiple times, was going through a drastic change in gameplay and tone, and it was being released exclusively on the console that was losing to its competitors and was associated with baby games. This is the kind of crap people on Twitter would clown on with the same two cold takes regarding the situation. It sounds like this game would be a total disaster. But when release day finally rolled around, everyone was proven wrong. It goes without saying that Resident Evil 4 changed everything, and its impact is not just limited to the series, but action games as a whole. Just as its predecessors did with 4, it established a lot of the aspects that would define third-person shooters as a genre, and it even has the added benefit of being actually good, too. The gameplay and mechanics were tight, the story was goofy but enjoyable, combined with the really good level design leads to a classic game that I'll never not want to revisit. It went on to have countless ports because Capcom wanted it to sell more than 2 copies, and going forward, it would pave the way for future titles. Which, you could argue was a bad thing. I mean, I like 5, and 6 has some redeemable aspects, but we're not in those dark times anymore, thankfully. Countless people have already shaken this game's salt shaker. I mean, there really isn't anything original you can say about it anymore. This poor thing has been sucked dry and my throat hurts. But I'm going to continue anyway. This is a very important game to me personally. On Christmas 2020, I bought this game after spending years of hearing its endless praise, and this served as my first proper horror game, aside from Haunted House, I guess. But you know, Haunted House is probably scarier. This, however, really got me into horror-related media, even if those elements aren't as big of a focus as they are in other games in the series. I played it multiple times, got 100%, and went on to play every main series game the following year, and Resident Evil became one of my new favorite video game series ever, and helped me dip my toes into one of my favorite genres. Which is a very big accomplishment considering how I've been playing games for so long now that it's difficult for anything to really leave a long-lasting impression on me anymore. I don't find myself loving games as much as I used to, but I'm always engaged with anything Resident Evil related, except for this one. However, when I started becoming a fan of the series, something interesting was going on behind the scenes. Capcom is no stranger to remaking their older titles. They did it with the original game, which turned into another one of the series' most well-regarded titles, and honestly, I still think it's the perfect encapsulation of the survival horror genre. But it wasn't until after the series made a step into a brand new era marked by Resident Evil 7 that they remade Resident Evil 2 and 3 as well. Resident Evil 2 Remake is a great game, and just like 7, an excellent case for why there needs to be more modern survival horror games. However, as good as it is, it's worth pointing out some of the game's glaring missteps. The atmosphere is much less present in comparison to the original's iconic camera angles and music tracks. I mean, the remake barely has anything that could be described as a soundtrack, aside from what, Mr. X's themes and the 4 notes played in the save room the first time you go in one. Not to mention the underbaked implementation of the A and B scenarios, which was admitted to be underbaked. One of the coolest aspects of the original game that added another layer of strategy and decision making and makes the connection between Leon and Claire's stories stronger, now turned into a total afterthought. All of these don't sound like deal breakers, and it would be ridiculous to claim that they are, considering how much good stuff is in this game, but the reason the original game is so highly regarded is not just because it had good gameplay. There are more aspects to it that truly elevate it to a classic that simply aren't present in the remake. It's a bitter pill to swallow, as the remake used to be my favorite game in the series until I sat on these issues more. It's still a really great game, but it just doesn't hold up as well as I'd like it to. Man. Resident Evil 3 Remake is far more blatant with its cut corners. If you judge it as its own game, then it's alright I suppose, but still lacking a bit. But man, you judge this as a remake? It's just over, dude. I mean, I am not convinced that this wasn't at some point conceived as DLC for 2 Remake. I mean, This horse has been beaten into the ground so hard that it probably looks like something I'd find in my toilet. Saying that Resident Evil 3 Remake is bad is like saying Hitler wasn't a very pleasant person. But whatever, I can acknowledge that it's still kinda fun, and I am over it at this point. And you should be too. Regardless, everyone knew that Capcom wasn't going to slow down on the remakes, as there was plenty of material to work with, and even more money to be made. So what was next on the chopping block? Code Veronica? Zero? More? Oh no, he's fine, and besides, you're not good enough to own him anyway. No, obviously, we're going to remake the game that doesn't need it. Well, it seemed as if just about everyone was excited over the announcement of the Resident Evil 4 remake. I was a lot more skeptical. And so was he.
This is so incredibly sad, but you don't care. You never have, and you never will, and that's because you were going
Unlike the other games that got remakes, RE4 has been re-released on just about everything. Somewhere out there you know there's a vending machine that runs this thing. And this is commonly referred to as one of the best video games ever made. Sure, it has its issues, but compared to a lot of games that are bordering on being 20 years old, this one held up incredibly well despite what tank control hating zoomers would tell you. Remake culture has gotten really awkward within the past few years, as it seems developers are a lot more likely to gravitate towards remaking an already beloved game instead of, you know, something that actually needs it. And I cannot for the life of me possibly fathom why this is the case. Resident Evil 1 got remade because technological advancements allowed the devs to capture the full artistic scope of the game and to bring the title to a new audience. 2 and 3 Remake, on the other hand, were less standard remakes and more so modern-day adaptations of the old titles, which had their own ups and downs. And after how 3 Remake turned out, how could I not be worried? I mean, RE4 is way more dense than 2 and 3. Think of all the corners they could cut. The island could be gone, the Regenerators will be relegated to a one-time quick-time event, you'll meet Salazar for 2 seconds before he gets killed, and it'll still be a Game of the Year nominee. Needless to say, my excitement for this all-new upcoming edition of Resident Evil 4 was about as existent as my will to live. Over the following months, though, we got more and more information. The development was pretty transparent, and it seemed as if great effort was being put into recreating the original game with a new lens. Because Capcom realized that this game was important and 3 wasn't. And it showed a lot of promise, and I started to get excited. When the Chainsaw demo came out and I finally got a taste of the game myself, I finally realized that maybe, just maybe, we were in good hands.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
So, I stayed up all night installing the game as soon as it released, which is the first time I think I've ever done that, and I was ready to see if they could really fulfill my impossible expectations. So if you've been living under a rock for the past 18 years, you'd know that RE4's plot, and most of the stories in these games for that matter, are not exactly what you're playing these for. I still expect a good story though, don't get me wrong. Despite what others say, an engaging plot really can make a good game all the better. The game follows Leon Kennedy, one of the protagonists from Resident Evil 2, who after surviving the Raccoon City incident from the original trilogy, you know, this, became a special agent for the United States, which he may or may not have consented to. After the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, goes missing, Leon is given a lead on her whereabouts, bringing him to a rural village in Spain. He soon finds out that the inhabiting villagers don't exactly take kindly to corny one-liners because of Las Plagas, a virus distributed by the Los Illuminados cult headed by one Osmond Sadler. The virus gives Sadler complete control over the host's free will. He essentially acts as the head of the hivemind. With his police officer buddies killed because you're not allowed to have friends in a horror game, and with only so much time left before bingo is over, Leon needs to find Ashley, who's now a permanent guest at one of Sadler's 7 Koopa hotels, and get out while he still can. Both of them also have to deal with the virus themselves after being infected upon the cult capturing them, and not going insane along the way. Throughout the journey, he meets Louise Sarah, a former collaborator of Sadler's, being hunted by the cult, and he's reunited with Ada Wong after their previous encounter in Raccoon City, in which she manipulated him to get her hands on the G-Virus. As well as Jack Krauser, his mentor from early training, who's now working for Sadler and helped kidnap Ashley to begin with. The story remains mostly similar across both the original and the remake, albeit with new plot details strewn about, but what sets them apart is their tone. The original game's plot was very stupid and over the top. I mean, back then it probably seemed badass, but nowadays it's just an action movie with one-note characters, corny one-liners, and so much cheese you could make a quesadilla. And I don't mean that as a derogatory thing. I mean, not every video game story has to be serious. Resident Evil has always had a level of corniness to it, and that's appealing in of itself. The remake, on the other hand, plays things more straight, or at least as seriously as you can make a game like RE4. From as early as the foreboding title screen and opening cutscene showcasing the cult in a far more sinister manner, the tone is set. We're going to try to make something with greater stakes and a darker atmosphere. However, I want to touch on that aspect later on, so that now we can finally get to the gameplay. The original Resident Evil 4 set a standard for all third-person shooters that would follow. However, despite the change in focus and gameplay, the game retained the tank controls from its predecessors. The 25-year-olds in the audience who don't have their driver's licenses may find this style obtuse, but the combat was specifically designed with this control scheme in mind. The name of the game was positioning and accuracy. Since you were locked in place while aiming, you had to find a safe spot to plant yourself to pick off enemies. This included deciding what body parts to shoot, to stun or trip up enemies, and finding the right time to reload your weapons amidst the chaos. While the remake follows this similar principle, it's widely changed now that controls have been swapped to a far more standard control method, allowing you to move while aiming. And while that makes it sound like the new combat completely misses the point of the originals, in tandem with the other changes made to enemy behavior and weapon stats, there's now more decision-making than ever. The original game featured a lot of combat sections with large groups of enemies, and it was your job to pick them off safely with the tools provided to you. It can take a little bit to get accustomed to the controls, but not too far into the game, you should be able to get a hold of the gameplay loop and pull off headshots and melee hits consistently. In the remake, with the added maneuverability, it comes more aggressive and strategic enemies than in the original. This is evident in the redone village fight. The Granados ran in the original also, but this time they're far more aggressive and will commonly cut you off while you're getting away from another group. And unlike the original game, getting an enemy out of your way isn't as simple as popping them in the face, because stun values, especially on higher difficulties, are noticeably more inconsistent. While shooting an approaching enemy with a higher firepower weapon like a shotgun or one sporting a faster fire rate such as the TMB is a valid option to stopping a Granado in their tracks, the strongest yet hardest way to teach an enemy about personal space is through the parry system. Certain enemy attacks can be deflected with a parry utilizing your knife. If your timing is off, then you'll only avoid damage, but if you get the timing just right, then you'll stun the enemy and set them up for a follow-up melee hit. Pulling one of these off is better than sex, and you can't argue with me about that because we both know you haven't done either of these things. Parrying should only be used as a last resort though, as the timing can be pretty strict, especially on professional, where you're only allowed to use the far more demanding perfect parries. More often than not, if you're depending on an enemy to approach you so you can parry an attack so you can deal damage without using ammunition, you're more than likely gonna fuck it up because you're an idiot. And that's not even taking into account that not all attacks can be parried. parried. You can defend yourself from most attacks, but some won't set up a melee, and others can't be parried at all. So it's up to you to figure out what attacks can be parried and prioritize which weapon types are the most dangerous in any given situation. For example, I know that the enemies with Morning Stars can't be melee stunned with a parry, so I'll either kill them first or run around them instead of attempting one. Shovels can be ducked under, so you'll bait out an attack and duck under them to evade it. Spiked bats can either be evaded or parried, and so on and so forth. This leads to a lot of on-the-fly deduction on which threats on the field are the most dangerous and who to pick off first. Just like the original game's combat scenarios, except this time, both you and your enemies have more maneuverability, which, while that does increase the difficulty, it also expands the variance in any combat encounter. And pardoning any of the nonsense that can come from that, I think this new take is incredibly fun. However, I do have some problems whenever it comes to the odd enemy balancing and certain aspects of the combat that aren't made entirely clear to the player. You can duck under a lot of attacks, such as shovels or thrown axes, but outside of a loading screen message, I think there's no indication that you can avoid these attacks in that manner. Meanwhile, for others, an input will appear on screen that you'll automatically duck under if you press the button. For the other attacks, though, I didn't even consider ducking under them for the longest time, since that action is primarily used for stealth. I seriously didn't think about this until the final boss, who has an attack you're supposed to avoid by ducking, and there's really no other manner of dodging it. But on topic of the enemy balancing, I think that it's mostly good. The pluggers that can erupt from the Ganados heads are retweaked so that the first ones that you encounter aren't the strongest ones necessarily. I really like what they did with the level 2 ones, because now you're forced to actually approach them to do good damage, and they have ranged attacks too so that they can close some of the space in between the two of you. The red zealots finally have some identity outside of just being stronger goons and can make multiple Ganados erupt into plagas out of the blue. So anytime you see one, the whole encounter turns into a hectic chase for trying to catch the red man before he makes everyone's heads explode. What I don't like, however, is that out of every crazy monster in this game, the most threatening one by far are the ones with no weapons. Unarmed Mr. Hands here will gravitate to you like you're a box of Cheez-Its. They will either lunge at you with a grab you cannot parry and you either have to stay outside of their range or duck underneath their arms, or go for a punch that has really awkward parry timing. There's next to no windup on either of these attacks, so when you're fighting one of these guys in a group, you're essentially flipping a coin predicting whether you should crouch or parry because you can't parry while crouching. Somebody please tell me why the most threatening enemy in the game is the one that literally doesn't have a weapon. But with all that said, I want to go back to parrying for a second. There's a common sentiment among the detractors of this game that parrying is a get out of jail free card that makes you invincible, and I really can't say I agree with that. Not only are the examples I've provided proof enough that parrying doesn't cover for you in every situation or is necessarily the correct option, but on top of that, you have to deal with knife durability. Throughout the series, the knife has always been borderline useless or completely overpowered. In 4, the knife was more of a utility item than anything. You'd use it to open boxes, and as a pro gamer tip that nobody has ever brought up before, you can attack enemies on the ground to save on ammunition. However, in Remake, the knife now has a durability meter to account for. Whenever you attack an enemy with a knife, perform a stealth kill, or parry an incoming attack, your knife's durability will slowly deplete and eventually break. As a consolation, you can pick up weaker or less durable knives in the environment in case your main one breaks. You can also upgrade the base knife to increase its durability or replenish it and tune up the attack power. And now, when I brought up weapon durability just now, I know that a bunch of you just pissed yourselves. This is one of those taboo game mechanics like fall damage that everyone immediately labels as bad without looking at the context in which it's used. And durability not only further encourages you to not over-rely on the knife's features, but skillfully utilizing your knives can end up saving you ammunition down the road. Some stun animations will allow you to use a knife on the enemy, instantly killing most and doing massive damage against bigger grunts like Dr. Salvador or the Brutes. Not only that, but knife executions can prevent plagas bursting out and causing more trouble. Also, there are now sections of the game specifically designed around stealth. Parts such as the village revisit in Chapter 5 with Ashley or the opening to Chapter 13 on the island are clearly designed with stealth in mind, and if you're careful, you can kill every enemy in these parts without alerting anyone or spending a single bullet. The original game attempted stealth for some reason, ignoring the fact that it had no stealth mechanics to speak of. It's like the level designers for the island were under the impression you could sneak around, but when they finished making it and realized you couldn't, they were just like, fuck it. And as we all know, everyone's favorite part of the original RE4 was the island. Thankfully now, that idea is fully realized and it makes for nice changes of pace throughout the adventure, as well as interesting applications to combat, if you know what you're doing. But of course, to make it so that the system isn't abusable, there has to be a limit on how long your knives last. Which makes the complaint about durability odd, as typically the same people who argue against the system are the same people who also claim that parrying is overpowered and makes you untouchable. If there was no durability, you could just trip every enemy and instantly kill them with no repercussions whatsoever. Not to mention, how is this really any different from utilizing ammo effectively? Ammo is a limited resource, durability is limited too, and should therefore be treated the same way by the player. Sorry to harp on this, but I seriously don't get why this criticism is such a huge deal to some people. I think this is the most balanced integration of the knife in the whole series. It's a borderline necessity in a lot of situations, however the drawbacks that you have to manage with it stops it from being game-breaking. And unless you're doing a no merchant run, you should never be short on knives. Though, with that said, that is one thing I can fault the game for. Since you can only repair the combat knife at the merchant, this means you cannot repair it at all if you're doing a no merchant run, which, yes, there's an achievement for, so the devs did intend for people to do a challenge like this. So if the combat knife breaks, then it's gone for good. I feel like this issue could have been mitigated by giving you the option to repair the knife yourself using the resources you pick up in the environment, or just straight up letting you craft smaller knives using resources. But on the topic of the merchant, he's here to stay, and he's better than ever. Just like in the original, you can obtain money from killing enemies and find treasures hidden in the environment to trade to the merchant for new weapons, upgrades, crafting recipes, and more. This time though, his services have been greatly expanded. In the original game, certain treasures could be combined with others to greatly increase their value. Ultimately though, this came down to grabbing a treasure and waiting until a later point in the game when you stumbled across its other half to get the most bang for your buck. In Remake, you can now find treasures as well as jewels, and you can pick and choose what jewels go where, and certain combinations such as matching colors or a certain assortment of colors can yield a much greater reward. The amount of depth this adds to the old treasure mechanic is way more than I ever thought it would be. In the original, if you passed by a treasure that combined with another, and there's usually only one of each, that was it, and you were forced to sell the other at a lower price. And there's just nothing you can do about it, huh? Now, however, there's a lot more freedom in how you use jewels and the means of obtaining them. What if I know I need another emerald for a good combo, but I skip over a big brute that normally drops one? Well, now I have the option to wait until later to grab another, or if I desperately need the money now, I can trade some spinels to the merchant in exchange for one, or use a different jewel, but maybe that one could be used for a better combo later. Oh, and right, that's not even taking spinels into account. What were originally minor treasures that didn't sell for a lot but were more common than stupid people on Twitter can now be dropped by certain enemies or obtained by completing side quests for the merchant. I'll elaborate on that last part in just a second. Spinels can then be traded for treasures, yellow herbs, new attache cases, or weapon parts to make the Red 9 actually usable. In order to get a good stockpile of spinels though, you will have to go out of your way to do merchant quests. Now the quality of these quests greatly vary. Sometimes you have to defeat a souped up mini-boss, meanwhile other quests will be as difficult as buying milk from Walmart. While I don't mind some of these requests being low effort, the ratio of low effort quests to high effort ones is pretty uneven. The ones that require you to backtrack or explore previously unexplored areas are severely outnumbered by the returning blue medallion missions that they made more than one of this time and show you their location on the map, grab 3 snakes, piss on this guy's grave, file my taxes. But I understand that the intent was probably to make sure there weren't too many off the beaten path so as to not break the pacing too much. And besides, there's plenty of reason to revisit old areas aside from side quests, such as accessing formerly locked areas with key items to find treasures, and there are even some weapons you can find to expand your arsenal. I can't think of any action-focused game in the series that has incentivized exploration and backtracking as much as this one has, and done it this well. This feels like a fully realized version of what Village was trying to do. While that game rewarded you for revisiting the village when you got new key items, honestly, it felt more like busy work since there are barely any enemies to deal with. It's kind of like you're taking a casual stroll, walking around and grabbing stuff like Ethan is going grocery shopping. Probably at that Walmart I was talking about earlier. In 4 Remake, not only do older areas sometimes get repopulated, but also you'll have to deal with mini-bosses, which can be a huge threat if you aren't prepared. And if you're doing a professional playthrough, then trying to slot in some of these quests into your run requires even more planning since you only get 15 saves and 5.5 hours to finish the run, so you have to be really careful when approaching some of these. But the rewards can take you a long way if you go out of your way to do them. Eventually, you can trade for an exclusive upgrade ticket that gives any weapon their exclusive upgrade instantly, when otherwise fully upgrading it before unlocking access to the exclusive and then buying that would make paying for college tuition look like purchasing a lollipop. If you're able to save up your spinels and put this upgrade on something like the bolt action rifle, you can start shredding ass like crazy even on professional and save yourself thousands of pesetas that you could spend on other weapons. Seriously, one of my new favorite inclusions in the game. The weapon variety also adds another layer of decision making. Just like the original, each weapon has their own perks to make them stick out from one another and allow the player to choose their favorites. The default handgun has average damage, but it has a higher critical hit rate and can be equipped with a laser sight like the original game to increase its accuracy and stun value. Meanwhile, something like the Blacktail has bigger reticle bloom and can't have a laser sight, but when fully upgraded it has a faster fire rate and higher damage. The bolt action rifle has a slow fire rate and can be a little tough to use against certain enemies, especially Regeneradores, but when maxed out, well, like I said, that hole ain't recovering. The Stingray, on the other hand, takes up more space in your inventory and it does less damage, but it has a much faster fire rate and is semi-automatic, which might make it easier to use. The Assault Rifle. So here's an odd one. It has the highest DPS in the game, and in the right circumstances, it will tear through certain bosses, but it eats up rifle ammo like a Persona fan eats dog shit. I could give a detailed explanation about all of these, but the point is that there's a lot of consideration when choosing your loadout. However, there's an equal amount of player expression. There are so many weapons to choose from that there's no way you can afford to use all of them in a single playthrough. So just like your kids, you're going to have to ignore some of them. Everyone I see that plays this game uses a different handgun and has their own favorite, and it's just such a cool thing to see. I personally prefer the Red 9. It starts out pretty rough with bloom the size of your mom and a slow reload, but paired with the stock attachment alongside other upgrades, it becomes a precise powerhouse that has the added benefit of being the only handgun in the game to not break focus when you shift your aim for some reason. And also it has a reload sound akin to shoving crack in my ears. The TMP is a super underrated supportive tool. Now sure, without the stock, at a long range it's about as accurate as an online mental health test, but at close range it can be used as an excellent stopping tool for an enemy who's getting way too comfortable around you. If you have a lot of trouble dealing with this game's stun rate on enemies, I can't recommend this weapon enough, even on professional. Speaking of which, one of my favorite additions is the bolt thrower. The mine thrower in the original game was a weapon that I honestly really liked because it reminded me a lot of myself. It's stupid, situational, and likes to blow people up. This is its replacement, and it's commonly written off as the worst weapon in the game, and sure, it is a tad unwieldy, but I cannot disagree enough. The LE5 is right there. So this game incorporates bullet travel time into its gunplay, because if there's something the horseballs in Red Dead 2 taught us, it's that realism makes games better. It's something you'll only ever notice when shooting something from very far away, so it's never really a huge deal, unless if you're using this, since the bolts don't travel as fast as bullets do. Paired with the awkward aiming, I can't blame people for not really fucking with it. However, with that aside, its replenishable ammo is not the only Its replenishable ammo is not the only pro the weapon sports. The fire sound doesn't attract attention unlike guns do, so it's great for some stealth sections or when you have to deal with Regeneradores. And also, just about any hit from this thing procs a stun on a Ganado regardless of difficulty, and sometimes even sets them up for a backstab. It takes quite a few upgrades for it to really get going, and is difficult to slot into a weapon loadout, but you get as much out of it as you invest into it, and I think it's a really creative and underrated weapon. Oh, and it shoots explosive mines too. Something great is that if you're ever interested in using a specific weapon, but you're afraid of it clogging up your inventory and being a waste of money, you can store it away at any time and take it out from the next typewriter you see. In the original, my inventory got crowded all the time, and I never had any room to carry weapons aside from the basic handgun, shotgun, and rifle. Which really sucked when I felt like using the TMP or Magnum, but I couldn't justify using them because of how much more situational they are. In the remake, if a weapon isn't currently useful and I need room for resources, I can store it away and take take it out later, or if I don't think it's useful anymore, I can sell it and get all of the money I spent upgrading it back to reinvest in something else. I felt incredibly iffy when I first saw you could do this, because it kind of feels like it takes away some of the player commitment, but now I think it's a great addition that encourages you to try all sorts of weapons out. If it wasn't for that option being available, I wouldn't have given the bolt thrower its time of day on my first playthrough and written it off as a gimmick, but now I get to see it for what it truly is. Now, while I think the weapon balancing is pretty tight all things considered, there are still some issues here and there. Most notably with the shotguns. The riot gun is easily the best one because of how solid it is right out the gate, sporting the tightest spread and the least damage fall off. The regular one has pretty subpar stats starting out, and sure, it ends up having a higher damage value by the time it's fully upgraded, but not by much, and that value is offset by the gun having more spread than the riot. And also, outside of a handgun knife only run, the Metoda is really bad. It's sick that what was once a New Game Plus exclusive weapon got added to the main game, but without the stock attachment, all of its stats they're terrible, and even with the stock, you'll eat up so much ammo with this thing if you aren't using the infinite ammo accessory. And that's ignoring how for God knows what reason the Metoda becomes available at Chapter 8, but the attachment only becomes available like a chapter or two later, and they both cost spinels and total up to 20 total. All of that for a mediocre handgun when you could save up a few more for an upgrade ticket and the bolt action rifle. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, I think the Metoda sucks! All of the handguns were viable in the original, but let's be honest, the Red 9 and Black Toe demolished the competition. Meanwhile, in the remake, I think you can make a case for using any of the handguns now. Except for the Metoda, fuck you. With all that said, you might think that this game is peak. And, well, yeah, you'd be right. But with this much added depth to RE4's gameplay comes far more opportunities to do things incorrectly. Let me preface this by saying that I love this game. I adore this game even. Aside from my ex-wife, I'd never spend over 200 hours of something if I didn't like it that much. However, there are too many people out there that like to pretend that this game is a perfect masterpiece. I mean, Resident Evil fans are just kinda like that. These guys see Capcom or anything RE related and put their throats to work while dismissing all forms of criticism against any of the games. There's a hugely unspoken issue of this fanbase being extremely narrow-minded and not being able to see the forest through the trees, which leads to most criticism of these games being dismissed, which isn't beneficial to anyone. So, let me just say this as a fan of this game and a huge fan of this series: RE4 Remake is so incredibly jank. This game can turn into a total carnival attraction at times, and you're the clown. Invincibility frames are far more limited than they were in the original game. Enemies on Professional will barely bat an eye when you are shooting them square in the face. And you thought the unarmed Granados were bad with their wombo combos? Try mutated Krauser's command grab with barely any startup that you're expected to duck under. Salazar's fight would be fine if he didn't shit everywhere in the middle of the fight where you're expected to be looking up towards him and the poop bombs are on the ground. I genuinely like this fight, but the poop bombs just kinda single-handedly ruin most of it. And tell me, what the hell is this? Then the Vistadores. You know these guys that were used like 3 times in the original? They're everywhere in this game. They're far less jank than they were originally, but somebody on the dev team was either way too proud of making these guys or had some kind of fetish because they're put in so many more sections in the remake. Normal enemy encounters I can deal with. The final boss though? What are you smoking, dog? This is like making a delicious chocolate cake and dumping mustard all over it. And the mystery is peace. Dolago's fight was never good, but outside of better controls, it's really not any more pleasant than it was in the original game. It goes on forever if you can't one-cycle him, and for some reason, Dolago recovers health whenever it dives in the water, making the fight go on even longer.
I want to stop playing. Exit. Pause. Quit. Whatever I have to say.
Yeah, despite what others would tell you, this game is very vulnerable to jank and bullshit. Everything I mentioned alongside lesser issues such as the bloom, the stun rate, the weapon sway, and even the bullet travel time, when it rains in this game, it pours. Especially on Professional if you don't know what you're doing. Modern RE difficulties have slowly begun to go from a legitimately cool challenge like Real Survival or Madhouse to Twitch streamer and speedrunner content farms. Village of Shadows was the worst of this. It had ridiculous damage and health values and was blatantly designed for New Game Plus, which is stupid considering how you'd probably just run through it with infinite weapons anyway or suffer otherwise. Most of 4 Remake's issues rear their ugly head in Professional mode. And most people will not experience these problems because most will do a playthrough on standard and stop there, or if they do play professional, they'll play on New Game Plus. Not helped by how a lot of hardcore RE fans think that having your balls nailed to the ceiling is a fun challenge and will hit you with the skill issue allegations if you have a problem with that. I should mention that both my main game and Separate Ways playthroughs for this video were played on a fresh run of professional, because even with its issues, I still find it to be the most fun way to play the game. In fact, I almost exclusively play on this mode. I can confidently say I'm probably better at this game than most of the people watching this video are. I've gotten S+ multiple times, including a no save playthrough, so yeah, don't even think twice about calling me bad simply for offering some criticism about the difficulty. How dare I strive for one of my favorite games to be even better, am I right? What I do really like about professional though is how all weapon modifications are unlocked at the start. This means that if you want, you can invest into maxing out damage within the first few chapters, and I really like that level of freedom. However, this comes at the cost of enemies being pretty tanky at the start, mainly whenever it comes to stunning them. The shotgun still works fine, but the handgun doesn't have enough firepower to stun enemies that quickly. Switch back to standard and the difference is night and day. Now this isn't Village of Shadows bad, far from it. You can still kill enemies pretty reliably at this point in the game, but you're typically better off just ignoring them instead. I find that it's not until chapters 3 through 7 that you get enough firepower to properly deal with enemies. With that said, while I do think the difficulty balancing and especially the stun rate deserve criticism, there are more ways you can offset it aside from raw damage. The TMP fires fast enough that you can stop most enemies before they reach you, there are interesting applications of stealth during some sections, the bolt thrower can stun enemies easily. The bloom doesn't apply to an action-based game like this as well as the survival horror entries it was introduced in, however, on a lot of weapons, it's really not that bad. Except for the broken butterfly, which is like... But you can get the laser sight for the default handgun and Punisher, or the stock if you're using the Red 9. These might not seem like necessary upgrades, but they really go a long way as focus shots have higher crit rates and stun values. Having it be compatible with the Punisher is actually really thoughtful design because you will have to readjust yourself a lot so that you can take advantage of the penetration perk. I still have problems with how Bloom was incorporated here, especially on the broken butterfly, because it's difficult to get focused and it's easy to break that focus. I never really had an issue with aiming in any of the other RE Engine games. 7 and Village in particular had great gunplay. I don't think Bloom is necessarily a bad thing, but in tandem with Leon's shaky hand and the sporadic movements of some enemies, it can create situations where you're fighting your aim more than the things actually trying to kill you. I do think a lot of these systems could have been handled better, but it's ridiculous to claim that the Bloom or the knife durability ruins the whole game, which ignores how there are things you can take advantage of to mitigate and overcome these issues if you get experimental. I just believe it's a stupid notion to pretend that a maxed out Blacktail won't make a dent into enemies on professional when we all know that isn't true. This game can get very frustrating, don't get me wrong, and it requires a lot of learning to know what to do when situations play out differently than you expected them to. But honestly, call me crazy, I find that kinda fun. In every other RE game, I sorta just know what to do during every section and my strategies work out 100% consistently with no issues. Which after enough playthroughs makes playing these games feel like going through the motions. In 4 Remake, I'm always doing something different and there are still plenty of sections that work pretty consistently, but there are a lot of moments where I'm thrown off my game. Like using a weapon I'm unfamiliar with, an enemy acting unexpectedly, being forced into a situation where I'm caught with all my weapons empty. Maybe this time that stupid box didn't give me a spinel I needed and I have to wait till the next chapter to get the merchant special Happy Meal promotion. But that added with the sheer weapon variety adds in so much more to every playthrough. I mean, I've gotten over 200 hours in this game and I still find myself in bad situations. It's cool to have a game that can still challenge me even after all the time I spent with it, albeit in some instances it's not exactly fair, but when it does come together, I think the combat is incredibly satisfying and has the highest skill ceiling out of every RE game. Seriously, when you play well in this game and land those perfect parries, you really do begin to feel like,
did you really think you could defeat me, wretched fool?
Ashley is another point of contention in Remake. For reference, in the original, she was pretty much the least bad escort mission ever. She was very responsive, you could get her to do things for you, and aside from the times when she got in your way, she never got in your way. In the Remake, Ashley behaves pretty similarly with some big changes. She can move around while ducking fire, and instead of telling her to stay still like a dog, you can now have her on tight and loose formations, loose having her follow you from a distance. attacks. Gonna be honest, I don't know if I'm stupid, but there are very few instances where I felt like that this system is applicable, especially since it's a lot easier to lose track of her on loose. She also no longer has a health bar and instead gets 2 hits. 1 hit knocks her on the ground, and any damage after that kills her. You can help her up though, and she'll get healed, so technically she has infinite health, and if you want, I suppose you can use her as a shield. But as much as I'd like to do that, and as funny as it is, helping her back up in the middle of a fight is incredibly risky, so don't do that! I've literally seen people online advise you to use her as a shield, and all I can think is that those are probably the same people who got the bad ending in Silent Hill 4. Like, dog, shut the fuck up. For God's sake, being obnoxiously misogynistic is my job. You know what I do hate about this dork, though? Whenever an enemy picked her up in the original, one shot made them drop her regardless of damage. In Remake, you might have to shoot an enemy 2 or 3 times to make them drop her, and it's really annoying, especially in Waterhall, where if one enemy grabs her before you have a chance for them to drop her and let her recover, everybody else will surround her and she'll politely wait for each one's turn to pick her up. No, it's my turn! Don't kill yourself! Wait, my wife left me! The lack of a wait option outside of these very uncommon Outlast-ass lockers in favor of a command that has very little use makes Ashley a lot more fickle in the remake and cause problems that aren't necessarily my fault. Actually, no. Nothing is ever my fault. Fuck you! I gotta be real, this is one department where I think the original clears. Her implementation is far from the worst, but sometimes I get the really overwhelming desire to blast her face in. And you know what? I suppose you can argue that's the case for the attache case also. I wasn't really thinking when I wrote that. The attache case is probably one of the best inventory screens in any game ever made. It was always fun trying to move stuff around to get the most out of the space, like you were playing a little puzzle game or something. Also, it did add a little bit of expression and took advantage of my OCD. Now though, well, there's an auto sort button that kinda kills all point in rearranging items yourself. I mean, there are some instances where you have to rearrange things yourself because the AI on this thing shits the bed, but it's very infrequent. This button is useful for keeping the pace of the game steady. I mean, after all, halfway through the original, I frequently had to move items around because I had way too much stuff in there. So it is nice to have something to take care of that busy work for me, but there is admittedly a lot of charm lost using this method. Like, sure, it could be cumbersome, and the option to ignore the button and sort things yourself is still there, but when given the option to make life a little more simple, people will always take the path of least resistance. Plus, I don't even think the menu is as snappy as it was in the original. Oh, but something cute was that I didn't even notice on my first playthrough that this was added, so I sorted my inventory manually anyway, and it ended up looking like this. Also, one last odd thing, I didn't know where else to put this. The charms. The shooting range is back, but instead of rewarding you money for getting high scores, now there are a bunch of different stages specifically designed around certain weapons. If you complete certain goals in these levels, you'll be rewarded with tokens that you can take to this gumball machine in order to get charms. Once equipped to your attache case, the charms can have a variety of effects ranging from increased chances of getting extra ammo when crafting, a higher critical hit rate on melee attacks, and then you get straight up broken ones like the striker, which increases your movement speed by 8%, referencing the Ditman glitch from the original game, which is pretty cute. The problem is that what charms you get are determined by a seed set at the start of the game, and putting in better tokens doesn't necessarily score you better charms. And I know that 8% doesn't sound like a lot, but it really does make a world of difference, so much so that the charms instantly got banned from speedruns because not getting the striker would mean an instant reset. While I like the idea of charms in theory, in execution I just don't think they work out that well, and even then the game is perfectly playable without them. I think they should have had some be obtainable outside of the shooting range, like being able to buy them from the merchant or getting them from side quests. Separate Ways has it where you can do the former, but it's mainly just the RNG focused ones, but the striker is there too if you have 100,000 pesetas to blow and you don't forget to equip it. Yeah, imagine spending that much money on something and forgetting to use it. Who would do something so stupid? Alright. So that was a lot of gameplay stuff to go over, so I think the video is just about wrapped up. Man. The stories of modern RE games have had a pretty negative stigma. Whether it's underdeveloped or boring characters, over-the-top ridiculous plots, or poor scripts, Resident Evil doesn't really seem like a series you play for the plot. and yet I do anyway. Not to say they're incapable of doing good stories, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, however the number of okay or bad stories greatly outweigh the ones I'd call genuinely good. The original RE4 story was, like I stated earlier, stupid. The plot served as nothing more than a set piece for the game to take place in, and I think the actual story and characters were an afterthought in favor of the gameplay. At least I hope they didn't expect us to take this seriously. But I'm not saying that in an overly negative way. A story doesn't necessarily have to be good to be enjoyable, and RE4 was the perfect example of that. In spite of the lack of depth in its characters, RE4's cast made up for it with cheesy quotable writing and ridiculous over-the-top scenarios. You can't go 5 seconds in this fandom without somebody telling you where everyone's going or whether or not it's that dog. When news broke that the remake was supposedly going to be taking on a more serious tone, I was nervous about how they were going to go about the execution. I assumed that the story was going to turn into a try-hard, gritty mess with no self-awareness, missing the soul of the original script. But what I failed to consider was just what you could do by approaching this plot in a more grim manner. I wouldn't say the atmosphere in the original was lacking, because that's a straight-up lie. But in my opinion, I feel like the remake takes better advantage of its setting. Well, despite what a shitty-ass Kroby Cat video with blatantly misleading footage and audio would have you believe. I think my favorite example of this comes from Chapter 5. Just like the original, this is the exciting section where you get to start babysitting Ashley. However, now this part has been reworked to be a lot more stealth-focused. The last part of the village feels like as if the whole place has gone on lockdown, under siege, and everyone is out for blood. In the original, you'd probably just run past and ignore these guys, but now you're expected to take things slower to keep Ashley safe and soak in the atmosphere. But my favorite part of this chapter's glow-up has to come from the cabin fight. Cabin fight in the original sucks ass. It goes on for way too long, and the tight rooms paired with the large crowds of enemies don't pair well with the game's control method. It's like slowly shoving a pine cone up your ass. In other words, it ain't fun. I mean, unless if you're into that, I suppose. Whenever I got to this part in the remake, I won't lie, I honestly forgot about its existence. At no point after this game's announcement up until release day did this part ever cross my mind. And when I finally realized what I was getting myself into, I couldn't help but think, oh joy, here comes the cabin fight. But there's a lot more room to work with here, and the controls make this a lot more manageable. However, that doesn't stop the segment from being chaotic. Throughout the siege, you begin to hear the surrounding Ganados chanting. Alright. And about the time the old fight would be wrapping up, the second floor begins to get flooded, and the already intense music begins to ramp up, and the Ganados start getting louder.
Let's see you climb this.
You know what happened at this point in the original? They fucked off for literally no reason. I mean, was it bingo time again or something? What is this, Bingo City? If the Ganados kept up the pressure, they would eventually get to Leon and Luis, so what gives? Are they stupid? The dev team for Remake saw this and asked the very bold question of what if they weren't stupid? So the second floor gets invaded as usual, but the music continues climbing up and up. The floors are getting flooded with these zombies. Luis starts freaking out, and when you think it should be over by now, Beef Boss busts down one of your barricades and starts swinging his hammer around, and you're either forced to deal with him amidst the rest of this insanity or try to avoid him, desperately waiting out the timer, hoping that they stop. But it keeps going, and the music keeps ramping up, and they won't stop. Why won't they stop? Holy crap, dude! And at the last moment when there's too much to deal with and you're running out of room to breathe, Ashley does the very first useful thing she's ever done in her life and bails the duo out. What a freaking glow up. This section I never thought twice of or even liked got turned into one of the most heart-pumping moments in any video game I've ever played. I played on hardcore for my first playthrough, and watching all of this unfold that first time around was unreal and set a proper tone for the rest of the game. You are out of your element, you are severely outnumbered, and you're gonna die. And can I just take a moment to appreciate the soundtrack, not just for that one part, but the entire game. There is a much wider variety of music in the remake in comparison to the old game, which helps all of these already unique segments stick out from one another even more. And nobody talks about it. This has got to be one of the most criminally underrated soundtracks in recent memory. Another part I loved was the Regenerators segment. Out of everything I was looking forward to being recreated, the Regenerators were the things I was the most curious about. You have to understand, on this site I grew up watching countdowns, and anytime somebody wanted to talk about scary enemies on a scariest enemies list, the Regenerators were the easiest target because this is the only Resident Evil game countdown artist played. Even though Crimson Heads are scarier, but that's besides the point. From a young age, I knew how notorious these things were, but dealing with them myself several years later was a whole different story. They were the scariest and some of the most iconic parts in RE4. I mean, a tad overhyped by the internet, maybe so, but regardless, there's a reason why these things are so memorable. Just don't let anyone know you can stunlock them with the knife. So get this, when I first played this game, I stayed up till midnight installing it, played the first chapter before going to sleep, and then the next morning I went from chapter 2 all the way to chapter 13. I played for over 10 hours that day, with breaks mind you. I know how to operate a shower, don't worry. But before turning in for the night, I realized I had to be close to the Regenerators. So it's 12 a.m. again, I'm making my way through the island, and I know I'm so close to the part, and then I enter this hallway, and my heart stops. I check the map, and all of it is here. Just like the original. It's such a does he know moment. You see the one scurry out of sight like a cat that just pooped in my shoes, and I've got my shotgun ready if he jumps out of nowhere. And after spending the next 12 years on the lock puzzle, we're finally there. And they fixed the mistranslation. Good on them. I grab the key card, and just as the autosave gives away that something scary is about to happen, the blue man finally reveals himself. And somebody had a little something they wanted to share with the class because the Regeneradores have way too much ass and made someone way too horny, and he's way too horny for me because he's running and I'm really scared. So past that good memory, I really like the remake Regeneradores, don't get me wrong. However, I'm kind of disappointed to say that after the first two, they lose their scare factor. And meanwhile, I thought the old ones were scary all the way through. I think the added mobility makes the encounters a lot less tense, because you used to have to plant yourself in the ground and not miss your shots while they slowly trudge towards you. Regardless, I will always treasure that memory of my first encounter, even if I like the original ones more. Oh, and I think we know what was in that mysterious bag now. I really like how the remake has its own unique take on these scenarios, and sometimes even does certain parts better. In fact, the game sometimes even likes to gaslight fans of the original, just like RE1 Remake did, though to a much lesser extent. I feel like you should all know where I'm going with this. The dog.
Hey, it's that dog.
I know I've been gassing up the original game this whole video, but being real for a second, this game kinda sucks balls and was hard carried by the dog. And guess what? During the lead up to Remake's release, they revealed that the dog was dead. For the first time in the history of the world, humanity was united in mourning the loss of the only good part of the game, and at that point, all hope for this remake being good was completely out the window. However, whenever the game was finally released, by some miracle...
You too, huh?
The dog was still there, and they were just gaslighting us this whole time! It's such a nasty but welcome trick, and dude, that turned the Gigante fight into the greatest say the line moment in all of gaming.
Hey, it's that dog.
They could have played things exactly the same as they did in the original, but by doing something as simple as introducing the dog a little later in the game to make us believe that it'd be absent altogether, it turns what would have been a, "Oh my gosh guys, this is just like the original, peak keto!" moment into a much more meaningful and satisfying boss fight. I don't think any game has gotten such strong reactions out of me in a very long time. Every chapter, every inch of the game, you're always doing something interesting. I mean, except for this. Maybe not this. More than ever now, I feel like video games spend more time making things look pretty instead of making a worthwhile campaign. This was even apparent in Resident Evil Village, which was a 10-hour long playthrough on a first run, but was still loaded with numerous sections that either took control away from the player or required you to engage in the thrilling gameplay of holding up. And even whenever I remembered that it was a video game, it was still pretty hit and miss in quality. Making it sound like I hate this game, but you know, he's a 7 out of 10. This is the first game I've played since Mort the Chicken that had a good length and had that time be occupied with actually meaningful gameplay. This game took me about 15 hours the first time around, which makes it on par with the original and longer than most other entries in the series, and yet every chapter has just as much care put into it as the last, whether you're gunning down enemies or exploring for treasures and other goodies. In an interview with the lead directors, they said they had the bold vision of making an actually good video game, and I think they succeeded on that front. The dev team was split, with one team working on each of the 3 major areas of the game. The scenario design in the original was really good, but man, some of these rooms are kinda cock. This is especially evident when you get to the island. Any segment there, aside from the Regenerador encounters, feel like they're only there to pad out the runtime. The game has run its course, and it is quickly running out of steam, yet it keeps going anyway. Like me whenever it comes to the editing process of this video. By having a different team working on each part, it makes each new area feel fresh, and dare I say, like its own game. My favorite chapters include Chapter 3, which has some fun enemy encounters, Chapter 9, which opens with a better version of the hedge maze, which has this quiet but atmospheric track accompanying it. Yeah, fuck you, Quoby Cat. Followed by a set of unique encounters that you can tackle in any order. Chapter 11, which was probably my least favorite part of the original game because of how slow and boring it was, has new life and story relevance breathed into it. I'll get into it more later, but with Luis tagging alongside you, it turned this part that I dreaded into a thrill ride that I look forward to every playthrough. Chapter 13 has a stealth section that, while it is pretty difficult, I can commend the developers for making it actually function, and I think it overall has the most natural mix of action and stealth in the game. But Logo, what about the cut content? I mean, we all know that if this is missing even a single iota of the original game, that the remake is just going to be total dog shit. After 3 Remake burned us, it's no wonder RE fans would be distraught over content missing from these remakes. However, in 4's case, I don't think it's as big of an issue. Well, because for starters, 1 playthrough of 4 Remake lasted longer than 4 for 3 Remake for me personally. But if you're gonna get up in arms and piss your pants enough to fill a Minute Maid bottle over the gondola ride missing or the guy in the truck forgetting his keys, then I don't want to be anywhere within a 10-foot radius of you in fear of contracting your stench. It can be upsetting that certain segments are missing, some more than others, but what people fail to consider whenever they criticize this are the countless other new parts that either replace those missing segments or got remade to be more meaningful and tonally appropriate than they were originally. That's where 3 Remake failed. That game wasn't mediocre just because the clock tower was missing or the park wasn't there. It was because those parts were missing and there was no substance to make up for it. 4 Remake adds new side quests, new weapons, new challenges, and expands on underdeveloped ideas that the original presented. I like to see it as a way to make these 2 games have their own strengths rather than one being directly better than the other in every manner, because we all know that was never going to happen in a million years. I once had some dumbass tell me that they ruined the Double Gigante fight because they got rid of the zipline that helped you cheese the battle, and sorry, but I can't hear you over this fucking amazing music! Also, I hated the lava room. That one can stay gone as far as I'm aware. I don't care. The one big thing that I can genuinely say sucks to see taken out was the U3 fight. I don't actually like the original fight that much past the cage segment, but there's no denying that the remake could have improved it to make it better. But also, if anyone had to get the cut, it did make the most sense to get rid of U3, since it kinda did just come out of nowhere and have nothing to do with the game's plot. But that doesn't make it any less of a shame that we'll never get to see this thing's true potential be realized. We'll get back to this one later. It's been a long time now discussing various aspects of the game, but I think it's time we start talking about one of the biggest improvements the game made: the story and characters. The original game's story works for what it's trying to do. What matters is that it's an enjoyable ride from beginning to end. However, there were also numerous plot holes and contrivances present that made it hard to take seriously, which, say what you want, but I do think the devs unironically wanted you to take certain parts of the game with a straight face. The remake not only reworks the tone as I stated earlier, but it also improves upon the story by giving the characters more development. Ashley is one of the big winners in this department. A garbage truck just drove by my house whenever I started recording this part. While I wouldn't say she was outright unbearable in the original game, much like how early 2010s YouTubers would have you believe, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who thought this boring, whiny character was any good at all. In the remake, she refrains from behaving like a 16-year-old rich white girl who just got pickles on her sandwich and now acts like an actual human being. They make an effort to develop chemistry between her and Leon, which not only makes for fun dialogue, but turns her into a genuine, endearing character so that I'm less inclined to use her as a shield. On purpose, anyway. She acts a lot more naturally to the situation around her. Instead of being stuck up, she's a lot more scared of her surroundings and afraid of being turned into a zombie. But throughout the game, she finds her strength to keep pushing forward and helping Leon. One of the most exemplary moments of the change to her character is shortly into the castle where the duo gets separated. In the original, Leon shows the slightest concern for her coughing up blood, and she responds by pushing him away all pissy-like and getting caught by the world's most obvious trap. Which, sure, it is funny, but it doesn't exactly make for an endearing character. In the remake, she loses control of herself for a moment because of the virus and ends up hurting Leon, which terrifies her and leads her to a far more natural reaction. Small changes to cutscenes involving her go a long way into turning her from dead weight that only gets you in trouble to a companion that tries her best to help. This is reflected in the gameplay as well. There are a lot more segments where she assists Leon and gets him out of tight situations. Not to say all of these are naturally included though. There are a few instances where her development is kind of ham-fisted and shoved down your throat.
Get this for me.
Leave it to me, I'm actually pretty good at this stuff.
Oh dude, she's so badass she can turn a wheel. Let's see if she knows how to make dinner too. Overall though, I really like how Ashley was rewritten in this game. I mean, sure, in gameplay she's still hit and miss, but when she's not giving herself up to an enemy for no reason, she makes for a fun traveling partner, and I think these two bounce off of each other in a fun way.
Was this the animal?
No, you can't keep him.
And instead of asking him for sex out of the blue after spending most of the game not talking to each other and Leon making a remark about her ass while she's being a pain in his, it actually makes sense why these two would enjoy each other's company by the end of the adventure. But man, if you thought Ashley was a big winner, then dog, let me tell you, Luis scored.
Hello.
While Luis was a cool dude in the original game, he was a rather underdeveloped character. Luis is a researcher who worked for Sadler to develop Las Plagas, but after seeing what he would end up doing with the virus, Luis stepped out of the project and tried to find ways to undo his bad deeds. In the original, he helped Leon and Ashley get suppressants and directed them to his lab to cure them from the virus, before getting pegged by Sadler, who went on to ignore Leon instead of killing him now because I guess he's had his fill. The most impactful part of his death was when Leon mispronounced his name.
Louis! Louis!
Remake Luis initially looks to be no different, and probably seems a little more sleazier than before, like the kind of guy who'd go, "Okay, Sancho, now hit the second tower."
Way.
However, there are more details hidden in the game to expand on Luis's character. Through some exploration, you can learn that when Luis was a child, he lived with his grandfather, as his mother died in childbirth. The two would go hunting together, and Luis would become fascinated with wondrous tales such as the adventures of Don Quixote. One night, his grandfather returned to their cottage having been attacked by a ravenous dog while hunting. Rumors spread throughout the village that he was infected with a disease, and in order to cleanse him and prevent further infection of the village, Chief Mendez ordered the house to be burned down while Luis was away. After his grandfather's murder, Luis left the village in order to pursue a career in biology. His efforts would garner the attention of the Umbrella Corporation, who hired him to work on their most dangerous projects. It's revealed he even worked on the nemesis from Resident Evil 3, which, need I remind you, is the Stars Killer, the Scourge of Raccoon City, the nearly unstoppable monster that could be knocked down with one grenade. Luis eventually left the corporation to return home, where he began working with Sadler on Las Plagas. But after learning of Sadler's intent on using the virus to unify those infected under his control to achieve world domination, Luis set out to escape the village with the help of Ada Wong in exchange for a piece of amber containing the parasite, which she'd hand over to Albert Wesker for his own purposes. Now, like all morons do, in the process of making the exchange, he gets caught, which leads him to Leon, who, learning of his previous connections to Umbrella, doesn't exactly take too kindly to him, especially considering that he's lived through the results of that company's evil deeds. From here on, Luis serves mostly the same role that he did in the original game, except Leon is much more hostile towards him. In comparison to the original though, Luis gets a lot more screen time in the remake, to the point where he's even present throughout the entire Mines chapter, which turns this part that has the appeal of watching paint dry that served no story purpose other than to get you from point A to point B into a fun roller coaster thanks to having a charismatic buddy accompanying you. If you couldn't tell, I love Luis, but under that charming and fun exterior lies a man with deep regrets. He understands that he can't make up for the true extent of his actions, but still ends up helping Leon to stop Sadler anyway, and his dedication to righting his wrongs helps out way more than he could ever realize. When he dies at the hands of Krauser at the end of the chapter, it actually hurt me. His death in this game is more impactful because we've actually gotten to see him more and understand him. And in his dying breaths, he asks Leon one very important question.
You know, I led a pretty shitty life. But now, eh? What do you think, Leon? People can change, right?
He may have contributed to this problem to begin with, but what matters is that he didn't run away from it and sought to help out those who were affected by it. And at first I didn't really think that hard about his final quote, but after dwelling on it some more, it runs a lot deeper than I initially thought, as it's part of 4 Remake's underlying themes. From the moment they met, Leon judged Luis based off of his prior affiliations with Umbrella. After that company destroyed his home and his innocence, of course he'd be hostile to anyone who worked for the corporation that ruined his life. And you know what? You probably misjudged Luis too! I mean, you probably didn't, but you might have. When Luis's redesign was first shown off, I vividly remember people saying that he looked like even more of a snotball than he did originally. And I'm not criticizing anyone for thinking that way, but it just goes to show that you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge a person solely based on their past. Much more so if they're showing signs of change. In reality, this version of Luis is way more noble than the original ever was. But also, that theme of people changing doesn't just apply to him. Leon is also quick to assume Ada is just going to manipulate him again and that she's still an irredeemable monster after their interaction in Raccoon City, but she ends up realizing what she's doing for Wesker is wrong and not only saves Leon out of respect, but hinders Wesker's plans for the sake of the world. I mean, it ultimately doesn't stop him, but, you know, it's the thought that counts. Krauser, on the other hand, is the total opposite case. Jack Krauser was Leon's former mentor when he first started working for the government. Despite now working for Sadler, due to their history, Leon retains a great deal of respect for Krauser and is stuck in denial over his betrayal. Krauser and Leon were both involved in Operation Javier, a mission that ended terribly with the death of numerous squad members and ended up being covered up by the US government. This is not explained in the original game. See, this new method of storytelling is smart, because originally Krauser came out of nowhere way too late into the game and didn't have a backstory until a spin-off rail shooter on the Wii a few years later. Yeah. Now instead of waiting till the island where there are only 2 seconds of gameplay left, Krauser now takes up some of the unoccupied space in the mine section, and the knife fight has actual gameplay to it instead of being a cutscene, which I think we can all agree is a change for the better. I've seen a lot of folks completely write off Krauser, with a lot of complaints of his redone character being directed towards the voice acting. It sounds a little over the top, especially in comparison to his old gruff voice, and I sorta get that. I mean, there were several points where I thought he was going to call Leon a butthead.
This is it, soldier!
However, I see this as a much more psychotic portrayal of the character. After Operation Javier, Krauser realized that strength is the most important thing in the world, and that he'd give up anything to acquire it, even if it meant sacrificing his humanity. Mid-battle, he relentlessly berates Leon, calling him weak, ignoring that I brought the Killer 7 to the fight. I see it as him projecting his insecurities onto Leon, because deep down, he understands that Leon is stronger than him. Leon has also suffered from the loss of thousands, some of those casualties he feels personally responsible for. Those tragedies affected him, but in spite of everything he's been through, he kept pushing forward, and he's just as determined to save people now as he was when he was just a police officer. Meanwhile, Krauser lost his way and succumbed to his hatred, and it's not until he's defeated that he finally sees that he is the weak one. He serves as a dark parallel to what Leon would have become had he given in as well. He probably would have looked like this. Sure, you can say his former corniness was the main appeal of the character. I just think this is a more meaningful version of Krauser. I feel like the reason why he isn't as well received in comparison to Luis is that Luis's development is highlighted a lot more. Meanwhile, Krauser and his relationship with Leon is, dare I say, more subtle and has to be discerned from their banter. Plus, Krauser is only remembered for the aforementioned QTE fight that everyone can quote because you can't skip it, so when you take away that and replace it with an actual character that people probably didn't expect to be there, it sadly kinda makes sense why someone missed the point of the new direction. Yeah, sorry, but the version where he has an orgasm and faints was way better. Man, why can't they make games like they used to? But you know, if we want to talk about a character that lost their corniness, Salazar immediately comes to mind. Or excuse me, Ramon as they like to refer to him now. Yeah,
No thanks, bro.
Salazar was one of my favorite parts of RE4. He's such a poopin'-ass little shit that embodies the original game's cheesiness to its core. Bro deliberately goes out of his way to set up the most ridiculous contrived traps and just to be a total annoying bitch. It's a completely different approach to any Resident Evil villain before and since then, and I love it. In the remake, more time gets spent developing the lore behind the Salazar family, explaining how the dormant plaga was originally found in the mines beneath the family's castle and how it was originally sealed off by Ramon's ancestors. Years later, after Ramon inherited the castle, Sadler approached and introduced him to Los Illuminados and told the impressionable Castellan that his family was responsible for sealing away Las Plagas. To atone for his family's sin, Ramon accepted the cult's teachings and had the mines excavated. This is where they dug up the bugs. The spores of the plaga would infect and develop in the workers sent to excavate, leading to the spread of the virus. Something interesting about Salazar's character that's hardly shown is his inferiority complex. Ramon was never liked by the villagers, and he was often cruel towards those who disrespected him. This complex is most apparent during his boss fight. At a certain point, he starts throwing insults at Leon that were more than likely said to him in the past. It's because of this that Sadler was able to manipulate him so easily. It's kind of unfortunate for him, but there's just nothing we can do about that, huh? While I do like this extension of Salazar's character, it's a real shame that none of that matters because he's not funny. Salazar has really manned up when making the transition between games. Basically, one very windy day, his hat blew away and he cried so hard that he hasn't been the same ever since. He's a lot less hands-on than he was in the original, and more importantly, he doesn't taunt Leon over the comms radio anymore. Yeah, it was totally unnecessary for him to do that, but that's what makes it so funny. He deliberately went out of his way to jack the line only so he could make fun of Leon more. Sure, the castle intercom makes more sense, but it's definitely nowhere near as funny. It's that back and forth banter that makes it all the more satisfying whenever you do get to his boss fight and finally get to shoot that little shit to death. But no, I just don't think that satisfaction is nearly as present. However, it is at that point that he finally starts to have actual fun interactions with Leon, and thankfully they saved all of his best lines for this part. I can appreciate what they did for him story-wise, but I don't think having interesting lore and being an annoying troll are mutually exclusive traits. There's nothing keeping you from having both. By all means, I still think he's a good character, but I honestly prefer the original Salazar for his performance and mannerisms, and I don't think I can say that about any other character in the game. Osmond Sadler is the leader of Los Illuminados and serves as the mastermind behind all of the events of the game. Now, I don't know what the rest of you might think. but in the original, he was a blatant grifter. I don't know if it was his dialogue or manner of speaking that gave it away, but I don't buy that this dude believed any of the bullshit spewing from his mouth. He literally tells Leon his plot to send Ashley back to the United States to infect the president, but for some reason insists on keeping her hostage anyway for the sake of ransom money? That doesn't matter because he would have taken over the world anyway if he just sent Ashley home. Is he stupid? He obviously was just using it as a ploy for world domination, and as typical as that motive is, and as dumb as the way he went about executing his plan, I still think he fit the B-movie antagonist role really well. You love to see him, but you also really want to kick him in his nuts. This makes Remake Sadler into a bit of an odd case. Unlike other characters in the remake, Sadler actually has less screen time than he used to. For most of the game, he's only ever shown in hallucinations and never shows up directly until Chapter 14. And how many chapters are there in this game? Man, what the fuck? I guess you could say he's small time. Sadler is a very strange character to talk about in Remake, because now he takes on a more generic cult leader demeanor, which does make him an infinitely less entertaining villain, but instead a more interesting one. A lot more emphasis is placed on the Sadler family lore and history of Las Plagas. Combined with Sadler's drastically changed tone when speaking about the virus, treating it as a holy deity, it brings into question whether or not he genuinely believes in what he's preaching now, or possibly if snorting those Plaga-induced fumes in the mineshaft all those years ago made him go crazy. Which would make his actions throughout the game make more sense, because in the original, he was obviously a very selfish person who saw human beings as numbers to achieve his goals. This might just be speculation, but in the remake, I think he honestly believes the world being unified into one collective hive mind would be beneficial to mankind, and his mid-battle dialogue supports this theory. But I also think it's not out of the question that Osmond Sadler is gone, and now his mind has been completely overtaken by the Plaga. Regardless of what's going on with him, even though that's definitely not as funny or entertaining as his original counterpart, I think it's an interesting direction to take him in. Plus, it has the added benefit of turning him into a far more personal villain for Leon than he used to be. After everything Leon has been through, Sadler tries to entice him into submitting to Las Plagas and giving up his autonomy to escape from the pain of the past. I love the old quippy Leon, and I always will. In fact, I'd go as far as to say,
Oh, Mr. Kennedy, you entertain me.
However, putting his immaculate dialogue and badassery aside, the version of Leon in Remake is a much more sensible progression of the character after the events of Resident Evil 2. Time and time again, Leon failed to save someone during the Raccoon City incident. He got toyed with by Ada, who was just using him for her own goals of obtaining the G-Virus, and the city still got wiped out after all of that. So after all of that trauma, it only made sense that he didn't really care about it anymore and was too busy dropping one-liners and suplexing cultists. Remake Leon is haunted by his past, but keeps moving on regardless of what he's been through. He still has a radical aura of badassery surrounding him, and he's impartial to doing backflips out of the blue for no fucking reason. However, that side of his is toned down to follow his character from 2 Remake better. And while they're less common, his one-liners that are still present are kind of recontextualized as coping mechanisms or ways of keeping his head cool in tense situations. He's still a badass who knows when to turn the cornball dial up, and I think that makes the moments where you can catch glimpses of OG Leon in him all the more satisfying to see. While Raccoon City affected him deeply, he doesn't let that stop him from making sure that next time things will be different, and he's not going to sacrifice his freedom just to escape his torment. Staying shackled by your past will hurt you and prevent you from moving forward. Don't take this as me saying that the original game's story was bad or anything. I still like it for completely different reasons. However, Leon's journey in that game really had no personal stakes for him. Even with Ada and Krauser being present, you could have replaced Leon with any other Resident Evil protagonist at the time, and Leon's character in future titles would have barely been affected. The story of the remake is Leon's journey of learning how people can grow and change for the better, or for the worst, and learning how to not lose himself into darkness after the tragedy in Raccoon City. Luis changed for the better, throughout the story Ada changes for the better, Krauser changed for the worst, first, and Leon grew, but kept his good sense of duty. On a bit of a side tangent, I never really liked how when people start discussing potential new games in this series, they always hard focus on what protagonist the devs should bring back. Personally, I feel like most of the series mainstays have had good bookends to their arcs. Sure, you can bring back Jill, Claire, or Chris, but haven't they been through enough? How is this a horror franchise anymore if you're just playing as badasses who've been through the same song and dance a dozen times before? However, due to how the original RE4 totally abandoned Leon's original character, he's kind of been stuck in this rut of never having a proper arc. And when I say that, keep in mind I'm referring to the main games. I'm not familiar with the other material, such as the movies. I don't mind his future appearances, but they don't develop on his original character, and in 6's case, that game is not self-aware enough for him to actually be cool. However, 4 Remake has now revisited and completed that previously deserted arc, and I can confidently say that Leon is now my favorite character in the series. He's hilarious, he's a badass, he's still a bit dorky like me for real, but his will is unbreakable. Even when faced with the unrelenting ghosts of his past and impossible odds of making it through the present, and even when offered an easy way out, that's nothing more than another chapter in the story of his life. Well, that was a lot. But I think the amount I had to say about the remake story in comparison to the originals goes to show just how much was improved. Once again, I'm totally cool with the direction they took with the original game's story, but it wasn't until I played the remake that I realized just how much missed potential there was with the original game's setting and characters. It's not all perfect, and I do think some of the charm was lost in a couple of areas, mainly when referring to Salazar, but I'm more than happy with what we got in return. I will always like the original game's plot just for how silly and memorable it is, but the narrative of the remake is leagues ahead of it in my opinion. However, we still have one last thing to cover, that being the DLC and extra content on offer. Now, Separate Ways was originally an additional campaign that came with the PlayStation 2 port of RE4. You played as Ada and got to see her side of the story and learn that she was helping Wesker retrieve a Plaga sample for his own desires. I already said just about everything I had to about the original Separate Ways in a video I made after writing this script, but the Too Long Didn't Watch version is that this is really boring, has a lot of reused levels, and overall the gameplay is heavily stripped down from the base game. I mean, seriously, if you really need my opinion on this, just go watch that other video, please. I need to feed my non-existent kids and get a 3DS capture card. Thank you! This mode wasn't included in Remake at launch, but instead got released as DLC a few months later. A lot of people weren't really keen on this, and I suppose that reaction makes sense considering that this should be the definitive version of RE4, but hear me out. Back in 2005, if you already owned the GameCube version, not only did you have to buy a whole new version of the game and own an entirely different console to play it, but even then, I think calling this shit mid is rather generous. Plus, Remake Separate Ways was only $10, which is a way better price than most other pieces of video game DLC being released nowadays, even in this same series. It's roughly 5 hours long on a first playthrough, offers much more replay value, there are more weapons to be used in comparison to the original's pitiful selection, and while yes, there's a lot of reused maps, they're all utilized in unique ways. Such as getting to walk through the cabin from Chapter 5 in the morning, a remixed castle sequence that acts as a stealth section, and a reworked lab. This mode spread its cheeks and shat all over Shadows of Roseland Village, which was stuck in a $20 bundle, lasted 2 hours, had next to no replay value, and you can tell the devs of that really didn't want to make a new asset if they had to. Though I should say that Separate Ways isn't lacking in its own problems, such as the first few bosses being HIV positive. They are way too tanky and gimmicky, especially considering that money is a lot harder to come across in this campaign due to the reduced amount of treasures. And there are just a few segments in general that don't work well with this game's mechanics at all. The Gardor room in Chapter 5 is probably one of the messiest designed segments in any modern RE game. They did this in the original and it wasn't fun. They brought it back in Remake and it wasn't fun, and they did it yet again here, but with even more stuff, and shockingly enough, it's about as enjoyable as nailing your penis to the ceiling. It's like they got a Mario Maker child to design this, or even worse, an RE difficulty modder. I think I just pissed my pants saying that! Aside from those infrequent bad parts though, I thought Separate Ways was still really fun from a gameplay standpoint, and it's easier to stomach a playthrough of this since when you know what you're doing, it should only take around 2 hours to complete. I streamed my first playthrough of this, and even though nobody watched, I still have a lot of great memories going through it for the first time.
A raccoon. Guess this is fate.
Airbot and Raccoon!
Airbot and Raccoon!
But one of my favorite things they ended up doing with Separate Ways was with Pesanta. So you remember this guy? Right, like I stated earlier, U3 was one major part of the original game that wasn't present in the remake. But despite his absence, there was still a tucked away note in the main game implying that he was hidden away somewhere. And instead of being a random hentai monster that was shoehorned into the game because they needed another boss, she now serves the role of Salazar's left hand. She stalks Ada throughout most of the campaign and infects her with some AIDS, which leads to her tripping balls, and while that might sound like a bad thing, I'd personally prefer to be high off my ass while fighting a tedious boss like this. I think this is supposed to be a callback to one of the earlier builds for RE4 that had a ton of fog and featured Leon suffering from hallucinations, so that's a cool bit. Anyway, Pesanta now has a proper place in the game's story, and even some lore regarding it being the former housekeeper of the castle, which helps this formerly shoehorned monster now seamlessly fit into the game's plot. The final encounter is great. You see the area you're in, you see the cages in the background, and by this point most of us knew Pesanta was connected to U3 somehow, and now we finally got to see it in the flesh. It's a pretty cool moment, even if I didn't really care about U3 that much. Oh, there he is! And this fight also has the bonus of actually being good, requiring a lot of careful planning and positioning. That being until you get to the second phase, which is also fine, until she roars and then... Oh, what? Oh, wait, who invited you? Oh dear God, the beast!
So much!
I also love how much content there is in this DLC. The main campaign is good enough, but they also included in costumes for the characters' old designs, even Luis's old vest, which looks so sick. I really like how this game handled cosmetics in general. I mean, sure, there are barely any available outside of paid DLC, but I like how you can mix and match outfits with accessories. It gives you access to so many funny looking or cool combinations to pick from. There's also the Mercenaries mode, which was added in a free update shortly after launch and got another free update to add in a new stage and a couple of new characters alongside Separate Ways. I feel like this was a direct response to having all of Village's DLC tied to one bundle when everything included in said bundle might be too varied for a lot of people. Sure, diehard fans like myself will want to experience all of it, but I know a lot of people who only bought the Winter's expansion for Shadows of Rose. And... man, you think the citizens of North Korea have it bad. So making the Mercenaries update free and having Separate Ways cost half as much as Village's DLC was definitely the right call. Anyway, Mercenaries itself works just like how it does in other entries in the series. Each character has their own loadout, and new to this game are their special moves that you can charge up and unleash for a short period of time. These include greatly increasing your stats with Leon and Ada, getting infinite ammo with Hunk, and unleashing your inner Obama with Luis. The mode is good fun whenever I want just a small taste of RE4's combat. However, I will say, up until Separate Ways was released, there were only 3 maps and 4 characters, which didn't give you a whole lot to work with. The Separate Ways update fixed the character issue, but only added in 1 more map. And even then, I'm not really huge on the new map since it tries to include every enemy type. It's kinda like opening up a bag of Doritos in the school cafeteria. But I gotta say, bringing Super Salvador back was pretty rad. I just hope that this doesn't have a negative influence on future difficulty mods for this game. Please don't. Also, the character balancing is kind of all over the place. You have poor Luis, who is oddly sluggish in comparison to the rest of the cast, is using the Red 9 without the stock, PU, and has the bolt action rifle with a slow fire rate. His insane amount of iframes on his melees and admittedly great special don't really make up for those downsides, making him a real hassle to get max rank with. Meanwhile, you have Hunk, who is total baby mode with infinite ammo skills and insta-killing melees. He somehow made the LE5 good. But then there's Wesker. So I get that he's supposed to be a power trip character, but man, his melee attacks are so fucking funny. He'll blast away at someone from across the map and go BOOM! Yeah, he may not have knives to prevent mutations with, but who needs that when his parry can counter literally anything and doesn't have the same restricted timing, meaning you can just throw one out and go BOOM! But then there's his special move where you get to And well, I guess that's every last thing I wanted to cover. When I first finished Resident Evil 4, I knew it was something special, and further playthroughs only cemented that fact in my head. This series is very near and dear to my heart, and while every entry has its own share of issues, including RE4, that never changed how much I cared about these games. Resident Evil 4 Remake was in a position where it felt like it could never match those insurmountable expectations set by its original counterpart. But, man, when I played it, when I went through all of those beautifully reimagined locations, when I was caught up in those engaging crowd battles that required on-the-fly decision-making, when I experienced a story that was actually good, that shit hit me harder than I could have ever anticipated. I got so excited for this game hours prior to its release, knowing deep down that it probably wouldn't match up to the original. But against all odds, it did, dude. It really freaking did. That first playthrough was one of the best experiences, hell, one of the best days of my whole life. Like, what the fuck? This wasn't supposed to be good. This was supposed to be ass. As someone who finds it harder and harder every day to be engaged with a video game these days, it means so much to me that I was able to play something that engrossed me from the very beginning and somehow kept up that momentum throughout that incredible 15-hour-long journey. I loved it beginning to end, from the village battle, reuniting with the dog bro, the insanity of the cabin fight. I ran from vertigo whenever I first played the original. This time though, he was trapped with me, and when I finally beat him, I popped off so hard I could have run out into the streets naked. The adventure in the mines, revisiting the Regeneradores, the epic Krauser fight, the music, dude, the freaking music. And by the end of it all, I realized something. Resident Evil 4 wasn't perfect. Deep down, I always knew that. I knew that there were parts of the game I didn't really enjoy, but I still loved it anyway. But when I played through the remake and saw how so many segments I didn't care for in the original were reworked into some of my favorite parts now in ways I could have never imagined, I realized something. My initial lack of hype for this game came from me thinking that Resident Evil 4 didn't need a remake. In fact, I've actually expressed that opinion before. I think everyone has said something similar at one point because, yeah, nobody online has had a single original thought in their head. Yeah, sure, RE4 could have definitely lived without a remake, and there are countless other games that deserve one more, but seeing how this one actually did go the extra mile to improve some of the lesser qualities of the original game instead of just staying complacent because nobody dares to criticize RE4 is signs of a true work of passion. Just like Super Mario Odyssey, this game is no masterpiece, but neither was the original. However, they're both great in their own ways, and that's something that really can't be said most of the time regarding remakes. In a day and age where we're getting remakes for old games that were already considered masterpieces of their time, that are selling themselves on the legacy of an older beloved product, it's amazing to see one of them actually take steps to improve upon what was already so heavily praised back in 2005. These games are awesome, and they'll both always have a special place in my heart. As for which one I'd say is better, the original definitely has more consistent mechanics, and there are good reasons to prefer its tone over the remakes, but as for me, I'd go as far as to say the remake is my favorite game in the whole series. However, I think it's kinda stupid to insinuate that one is inherently worth less than the other. Yeah, the remake is way better than the boring old one with garbage tank controls. No, the remake is a total cash grab that spits in the face of the original masterpiece. I mean, where is all the sexual harassment? Like, no, dude, both these games are great for very similar but also very different reasons, and at the end of the day, that's what I was hoping for the most. Because you could never replace the original no matter how good the remake was. It's too important to be replaced. Touching up on some of the OG's weak links and expanding on unexplored elements while offering a familiar yet subversive experience was the best choice they could have gone with, and I'm happy that that's exactly what they did. No need to debate with yourself about which version you should play. Play both, original first preferably, but don't miss out on either of these games. And since this conversation is inevitable, if they're going to remake Code Veronica, or especially RE5, which is kinda all but confirmed at this point, all I can hope is that they take the same avenue and put in the same amount of care. I don't mind if we don't get to see it till the end of the decade. A 5 remake as good as this, while refining some of the combat flaws, could be incredible. Though I would also like it if Capcom started focusing on newer projects instead. Remake culture is kind of awkward, because while most remakes released nowadays aren't bad, it's kinda concerning how much developers are having to rely on recreating old games that are already well liked rather than remaking flawed games that could be great, or making something brand new entirely. I just want this series to have the proper care put into it is all. Though I'm very interested in what the Resident Evil 6 remake is going to look like in 2032. How the hell do you remake a game like that? Tell me how this game is going to have anything good left in it if they're going to remove women. If you haven't already, and I haven't made it clear enough yet, play both of these games. They're both once, or I guess twice in a lifetime experiences that I'll hold on to until the day I die. The original served as an amazing introduction to one of my favorite game series, and the remake gave me one of the greatest experiences ever in a time where I needed it more than ever, despite how concerned I was for it. Against all odds, Capcom managed to catch lightning in a bottle all over again. I will always love Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake.
Story of my life.